right. We're with Liz Truss, who's the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, here at CPAC in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be on.
So you've lately been calling for something approximating a MAGA movement in the United Kingdom. There might be some who would argue that such a movement is already burgeoning if you look at the success of reform in the UK recently.
That's a political party, which is slightly different from a MAGA movement. Or indeed, I've also called for a Tea Party movement. But what we need is a grassroots uprising in Britain about what is going on in our country, because the problem isn't just in politics, it's also in the bureaucracy, it's in the system. So that's why I'm talking about a wider movement of people.
And you've also sort of appropriated the term deep state and applied it to the British context. You've used that to refer to the civil service and so forth, which we see now being targeted for reforms here. Would you extend that critique, if you like, to the security agencies, the intelligence agencies, MI5, MI6, or are those sort of in a different category in your mind in terms of what needs to be reformed?
I definitely think those organisations need to be accountable, but I would say in Britain they're less obviously the problem than... So if we take the issue of the Pakistani grooming gangs, the problems there are in the police and they're in the Home Office. So those are parts of the bureaucracy and the public services where the biggest problems are.
Okay. So when you were foreign minister and then prime minister, Ukraine was a major topic. That's back in the news today. I reviewed some of your statements over the course of the war. You called for the defeat of Russia. You warned against appeasement of Putin. What would defeat of Russia even look like now militarily? How would that be achieved? Would it require the toppling of the Russian government in some form? Like, how does your previous calls for the defeat of Russia translate to what's going on now?
I mean, what my concern is, and always has been, is about Russian expansionism that Putin has laid out, and I think it was back in the Munich Security Conference 2007, but he laid out his vision of a greater Russia, which included pretty much everything that was in the Soviet Union. So my concern is about that expansionism. So what I want to see is I don't want to see Putin rewarded for his aggression in Ukraine, and I want to make sure that Russia is not advancing into Europe.
And what would a reward look like? Would it be recognition of the annexed oblasts pursuant to some peace deal? Like, tangibly, what would be a reward that you would be?
First of all, I am not, as I was previously, privy to what is actually going on the ground now. And I know there's lots of media speculations, lots of reports. I think unless you're the person actually looking at the intelligence of what's going on. I remember when I was in the job, like lots of stuff that was reported in the media was completely untrue from our intelligence. So I'm not going to sort of speculate on the current state of the Russian army or the Ukrainian army or the current position. But the fundamental principle here is Russia should not be rewarded, because that just sends a very bad signal to Putin himself, which it would result in further incursions, but also a bad signal to President Xi.
What's an example?
I want to see, why do I support President Trump? Because I believe in a strong America and a strong West. And what we had under President Biden was a weak America and a weak West. And he was leading the rest of the West in a very, very negative direction. And we're still seeing some of that continuing in European countries under left-wing governments in France and Germany and so on. So what I want to see is I want to see the West win. And the West winning means that our adversaries don't win. And Russia is in league with China, they're in league with Iran. We don't want them to win. We want the war to end. Of course we all want the war to end.
What's an example from your premiership of a time there were misreported media accounts of what the intelligence services were saying?
Oh, I mean, all the time. I'm not sure I can remember the precise details or even I'm able to actually reveal them, but it was all the time.
Okay. You mentioned Germany. The German federal elections are this coming weekend. There's been a lot of talk around what the implications would be if the alternative for Germany, or AfD, gains power. They've had a particular view on the Russia issue where they've been skeptical of sanctions, which you were a strong proponent of. What is your assessment of the AfD, and would they would you expect them to somewhat moderate their positions? Were they to gain power in some fashion, or are they totally out of bounds as you can see it?
First of all, I think every political party should have a right to participate in an election, and I get very worried about the censorship issue and parties being censored or not able to participate. I think that's completely wrong. I think the German people should be able to vote for the AfD if that's what they want. Absolutely.
So they shouldn't be prescribed by the state.
I just think it's appalling, and it goes back to this thing that what systems are now trying to do in Europe is sort of set tram lines for what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And going back to my premiership, that was the problem, that essentially the civil service and the Bank of England were trying to set tram lines for what is acceptable economic policy according to their views. And that's the increasing trend in the European Union of saying these things are or aren't acceptable, like when they intervened in Poland over what they were doing in the justice system. Obviously, they're not intervening now. Donald Tusk's in charge. That's totally different. But under the Law and Justice Party, they were trying to intervene. And I think these attempts to push politicians into tram lines ultimately will fail, because the public will ultimately revolt against policies they don't like. And you've seen that in particular in the case of migration. Migration was... there's been a lot of pressure on European countries to accept certain levels of migrants, and that is resulting in people looking for other parties to vote for at the election.
One thing that struck me about British politics is that, particularly in the realm of foreign policy, there's more uniformity between the two major parties than may be the case elsewhere, such as in the United States. Not all the time. But on the issue of Ukraine in particular, Labor and the Conservatives basically have one mind on that issue, maybe with some marginal differences. But now, for example, Keir Starmer has called for the deployment of some European peacekeeping force to Ukraine in league with Macron in France and perhaps others. And that seems relatively in keeping with what you might support or what others, but you can correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm in favour of British troops on the ground.
You're not? Okay.
No, I'm not in favour of that. On Ukraine, I think there is more unanimity, and actually it's a reflection of what the British public want. There's great support from the British public, and people are very fearful of further war and conflict in Europe. But on the issue of Israel, I think there is a big split between Conservatives and Labour. And Labour have been, they put a partial arms embargo on Israel. They've accepted the ICC court judgment on Netanyahu, which I think is completely wrong. They've been appeasing Islamists in Britain. So on Israel, there's complete disagreement on foreign policy.
Speaking of Israel, Donald Trump, I'm sure you know, made a rather brash proposal for the United States to, quote, take over Gaza. We don't really have the
forward to it.
Okay, we don't really have the full specifics of it. Maybe they'll rename it Gaza Lago, with casinos and hotels or something. Do you find that to be a plausible proposal to turn Gaza into some sort of U.S. military protectorate?
No, I think Donald Trump is an out-of-the-box thinker, and I think in some of these difficult disputes that have been running for a long time, and after the appalling attacks of October the 7th, new ways of doing things need to be thought of. And if you look at the big foreign policy success of Trump's first term, the Abraham Accords, that was by thinking differently. So I'm all for that.
The Abraham Accords, though, in fairness, didn't really address the Palestinian issue, which is now blown up.
I'm talking of innovative views of foreign policy that are going to achieve different results. That's what I'm talking about.
Do you think innovative is the right word to describe potentially doing a mass expulsion of 1.8 million people? That's what Trump called for. Maybe it's bluster. We don't know. But I don't know. I could maybe think of some other adjectives.
You don't know is the point. You don't know is the point.
Okay.
One of Trump's advantages when it comes to diplomacy is his unpredictability.
He's repeated this proposal over and over now, so it's not just some off the cuff thought he apparently had. I mean, he seems to be pushing it cogently. So, I mean, do you think it's practicable? Let's say it were to be implemented.
This is not. I just don't think it's the way to think about what he's been saying. I think you're sort of trying to interpret it in a way that it's not meant.
Okay. I want to ask you about something that's been a bone of contention for quite a while in terms of the initial stages of Ukraine policy. You've heard it widely alleged that Boris Johnson, when you were foreign minister, he made a trip to Kyiv, and it was in the midst of a stage of potential negotiations between Ukraine and Russia in the Istanbul format, where perhaps there might have been an early ceasefire brokered in exchange for certain concessions. And the theory has it that Boris Johnson, perhaps as an emissary of Joe Biden, exerted some sort of pressure that discouraged Ukraine from continuing on in those negotiations because they understood that they would get a steady supply of weapon systems and continue the war. Does that narrative have any truth to it, or do you dispute it?
Well, if it is true, I certainly don't know anything about it, and I don't particularly think it's true.
Well, you were foreign minister at the time, right?
I'm saying.
Yeah. So you would probably know, right?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. I briefly mentioned the Reform Party in the UK and how you might distinguish it from, I guess, a MAGA movement. It is a party. It maybe has some perhaps libertarian bents to it. How do you anticipate for there to be some collaboration in terms of whatever remains of the Conservative Party and the Reform Party? Will there be a pact or alliance? Would you be in favor of that?
Likely, given the people involved. What would my ideal government be after the next general election? I think there's a good opportunity to put together the best of Reform and the best of the Conservatives, but I don't necessarily think that's likely to happen.
Is that because of Richard Tice or Nigel Farage, or like the personalities at the top of that party?
The makeup of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. I think there'll be quite a few MPs who just aren't in favour of any kind of deal with Reform.
And is that because they are maybe more aligned still with the pro-EU tendency within the party, or
definitely more aligned to the left? Definitely.
Okay. And how sizable are they after the last general election? Do they wield? Because you've had a lot of people have left Parliament since, including yourself, since 2024.
I described the results of the 2024 election as survival of the wettest, and the wettest is the British term. I think you call it squishy. So that's the makeup of the parliamentary party, is more in that direction. Hence why I don't think there'll be a deal.
How is your reception in the United States? Because I know you attended the inauguration of President Trump last month. I recall seeing you at the Republican convention last summer in Milwaukee. Now you're here. How is your reception here in the U.S. compared to in Britain, where how to put it, sometimes you're the object of scorn in the
object of scorn for the British establishment. That's not the reaction of ordinary people in Britain. It's the reaction of a very powerful media and elite class. And they're the problem.
Does that include Rishi Sunak?
Well, I would say he's more in that group than otherwise, yes.
Have you ever, when's the last time you spoke to Donald Trump?
Last year.
Really? What was that about? How did it go?
I'm not going to go into details about it.
Oh, really? Was it confidential?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough.
Good. Are we close to big?
Would you like to finish? I'll ask a final question. In your book, you open with a scene from the Queen's final days. And that was a very interesting period. It was that she died about 24 hours after you assumed the premiership, if memory serves.
2 days, but yeah.
It was 2 days. How did you deal with that in terms of? I mean, it's hard to imagine anybody coming into office with more kind of psychic turmoil than that. I mean, have you spoken to other heads of government about what that was like?
Extraordinary time. It was an extraordinary time.
And what lessons do you take from that going forward, if any?
There's not really much lessons you can take about a sovereign who'd been on the throne for 70 years dying, because that's a pretty unusual event.
Yes.
So,
and how is the king doing?
He's doing very well. He's doing very well. And I think the British monarchy is something in our constitution that works.
Because sometimes King Charles is...
Unlike the fake Tony Blair stuff.
Because sometimes King Charles has been lambasted by certain people on the right for being in favor of certain climate initiatives and so forth.
It's just misunderstanding British politics, which is he isn't involved in politics. He's just not involved. He's a constitutional monarch.
And that's the way you'd like to see it remain. Not remain in the EU. That's over. But remain in the monarchy. All right, well...
Thank you very much.
All right, Liz Truss, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.